My name is Maya Reeves, and I was 20 years old when my parents sat me down in the formal dining room of their Beacon Hill townhouse and told me I was no longer their daughter. Not in the heat of an argument, not in the wreckage of some catastrophic mistake. They told me calmly, across the same mahogany table where we had eaten Christmas dinner every year of my life, with the same measured tone my father used in board meetings and my mother used when she was returning something to a store. It was the most efficient disowning in history. 12 minutes, start to finish. I know because I watched the clock on the wall behind my father's head the entire time, the way you fix on something small and concrete when the larger thing happening is too enormous to look at directly. They had a list of reasons. I had chosen an environmental science degree instead of business. I had written an op-ed in the university paper about predatory development practices in low-income neighborhoods where, it turned out, my parents owned significant property. I had, in my father's words, made my values incompatible with the family's interests, and I had done all of this, my mother added, after everything they had provided, which she listed with the efficiency of someone reading from a prepared document, because I believe she was. At the end of the 12 minutes, my father slid an envelope across the table. Inside was $300 in cash and a one-page document formally severing my financial dependency, which they had apparently had drawn up in advance. My mother had already packed a duffel bag. It was waiting by the door. I took the envelope. I took the bag. I walked out of the house where I had grown up and stood on the brownstone steps in the November cold and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the world I was standing in was entirely different from the one I had been standing in 14 minutes ago. The street looked the same. The gas lamps were lit. The cars were parked in their usual spots, but the ground under everything had shifted, and I was the only one who felt it. I did not cry on the steps. I cried later, in the bathroom of a Dunkin' Donuts 2 blocks away, and then I washed my face and tried to figure out what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was a letter. It arrived 3 days later, forwarded to a friend's couch where I was temporarily existing. It was from a law office in Asheville, North Carolina, a single sheet informing me that my aunt, Caroline Reeves, had died 6 weeks earlier and had named me the sole beneficiary of her estate. I had not known my aunt was dead. I had not known my aunt particularly well at all, in the way that you don't know the family members your parents have quietly made clear are not to be discussed. Caroline was my father's older sister, and she had been absent from every family event I could remember, referred to occasionally and briefly as someone who had made her choices, which was the way my parents referred to anyone who had disappointed them enough to stop existing in their conversational landscape. Her estate consisted of a single piece of property, a cabin on 4 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains outside a small town called Wren, North Carolina. The letter noted, with the careful neutrality of lawyers delivering bad news, that the structure was in significant disrepair and that there were no liquid assets. The property was mine, free and clear, taxes current through the end of the year. After that, the liability would be my own. I read the letter twice. I looked at my $300. I looked at the duffel bag on the floor beside the couch. I drove south the next morning. The drive from Boston to the Blue Ridge is about 15 hours, and I did it in 2 legs, sleeping in my car at a rest stop in Virginia. The landscape changed slowly, and then all at once, the flat coastal geometry giving way to the rising, folded terrain of the mountains, and by the time I turned off the state road onto the dirt track the lawyer's directions described, the elevation was high enough that my ears had popped twice, and the trees on either side of the road were old-growth hardwoods going bare and skeletal in the November cold. The cabin was at the end of half a mile of rutted track, in a clearing that had once been larger and was now being slowly reclaimed by the forest on all sides. It was a small structure, maybe 600 square feet, built from logs that had been there long enough to go dark and settle into each other with the permanence of things that have decided to stay. The porch had partially collapsed on one end. The chimney had lost several courses of stone from the top. 2 of the 4 windows I could see from the driveway were cracked, and one had been covered from the inside with a piece of plywood so old it had warped away from the frame and let in a finger of grey light. I sat in the car for a few minutes and looked at it. Then I got out, found the key the lawyer had mailed with the letter, and went inside. The interior smelled of wood smoke and thyme, and something underneath both of those things that was particular and unplaceable, the smell of a space that has been lived in singularly by one person for a very long time. It was one main room with a kitchen along one wall and a wood stove in the corner and a back room that served as a bedroom. The furniture was minimal and hand-built, the kind of things a person makes themselves over years rather than buys. A table, 2 chairs, a bed frame with a good mattress, which surprised me. Shelves along every available wall, packed with books and notebooks and labelled glass jars of dry goods and tools, and the accumulated material of a life organised around self-sufficiency rather than appearance. It was not comfortable in any way my parents would have recognised that word. But it was not nothing. Caroline Reeves had lived here, alone, for what the neighbours I later met told me was close to 30 years, and she had made it a place with a specific and deliberate character. Everything in it had been chosen, or built, or kept because it served a purpose. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was wasted. I found wood stacked under a tarp on the side of the cabin, dry and split and ready. I figured out the wood stove by trial and error over the course of an hour. By nightfall, the main room was warm enough to stop seeing my breath, and I sat at Caroline's table with a can of soup I had bought at a gas station in Rennes, and I looked around at the life she had made here and tried to understand what I had inherited. That first week was the hardest. I had no income, dwindling cash, no plan, and a structure that revealed new problems every day. A section of roof that leaked when it rained, a pipe under the kitchen sink that had been repaired so many times the repair itself was failing, a gap in the foundation on the north side where cold air came up through the floorboards in a steady, insistent draft. I dealt with each problem in order of urgency, the way Caroline's notebook suggested she always had. I found her maintenance logs on the shelf above the wood stove, years of them, recording every repair and its method and what she had learned from doing it. She was meticulous. She wrote in a clear, precise hand that reminded me uncomfortably of my father's, and I wondered for the first time what these 2 people had shared, before whatever had separated them had done its work. I got a part-time job at a hardware store in Rennes within 2 weeks. The owner, a woman named Dot, who was 73 years old and had no patience for inefficiency, sized me up in about 45 seconds and offered me 20 hours a week at a rate that was fair for the town, if not for my student loan statements. I took it without negotiating. It covered food and propane and gave me enough left over to start buying materials for the repairs the cabin needed. I was not happy exactly, but I was occupied, which is a different thing and sometimes more useful. There was too much work to do for despair to get much purchase. Every day had a specific and concrete set of problems that responded to specific and concrete solutions, and after 4 years of being told that my interests and choices were impractical and irresponsible, there was something genuinely stabilizing about a world that confirmed its problems with a drip of water on your face at 2 a.m. and rewarded your solutions with a dry floor by morning. I had been at the cabin for 6 weeks when the storm came. It arrived on a Thursday, a nor'easter that had swept down the coast and gathered itself over the mountains with more force than the forecast had suggested. By midnight, the wind was sustained at 50 miles an hour, with gusts that shook the cabin in a way that felt structural. And I was awake in Caroline's bed, listening to the building talk to itself, the old logs flexing and settling, the roof popping and creaking under the weight of the wet snow that had been falling since 8 o'clock. I had every lamp I owned burning, and the wood stove packed as tight as it would safely hold, and I lay there tracking the sounds the way you do in a strange place during a bad storm, cataloguing the normal ones and listening for anything else. The sound that woke me at 3 in the morning was not loud. It was a low, sustained crack, the kind of sound that precedes rather than accompanies a structural failure. And it came from the north wall of the main room, the wall with the foundation gap, the wall that had been giving me the most concern since I arrived. I was out of bed and through the door before I had fully decided to move. The north wall had not collapsed. What had happened was that the freeze-thaw cycle of the storm, combined with the existing gap in the foundation, had moved the base of the wall inward by what looked like 2 inches, and the drywall, which I now noticed was newer than the rest of the interior, a patch job done at some point in the last decade, had cracked along a vertical seam from floor to about chest height. The crack was wide enough to put my hand in. I stood there in the lamplight with the storm pressing against the cabin walls, and I looked at the crack, and what I felt first was the straightforward anxiety of a person who cannot afford a structural repair in winter. What I felt second, about 10 seconds later, was something else entirely. Behind the drywall, visible through the crack where the 2 sections had separated, was metal. Not the metal of a pipe or a wire conduit or any of the other practical things that live inside walls. It was a flat, matte grey surface, and it was uniform, and it went as far in both directions as the crack allowed me to see. I got a flashlight from the kitchen and put the beam through the gap. The surface resolved into a door, a heavy door, flush-mounted inside the wall, with a combination dial at its center and a handle below it, and the particular deliberate thickness of something designed to resist being opened by anyone who didn't know how. A vault. My aunt had built a vault inside the north wall of her cabin. I stood there for a long time in the storm. The flashlight trained on the dial, and the sound of the wind was very loud, and the cabin shifted around me, and I did not move. Caroline Reeves had lived here alone for 30 years. She had been excised from the family so completely that her death had gone unannounced, and her niece had to learn about it from a lawyer's forwarded letter. My parents had never mentioned her in any way that suggested anything other than embarrassed dismissal. She had left me everything she had, which appeared to be a rotting cabin and 4 acres of mountain land, and she had been meticulous about everything she did. And behind the wall of her cabin there was a vault. I thought about what my father had said when I showed him the lawyer's letter on the 3rd day of my temporary couch existence, before I drove south. I had called him, because I wasn't sure if the inheritance changed anything, if it was some kind of opening. He had been quiet for a moment after I told him, and then he had said, with a flatness that I now understood differently than I had then, "That property is worthless. Don't let them talk you into spending money on it." And then he had ended the call. "Don't let them talk you into spending money on it. Not. I'm sorry about Caroline. Not. I didn't know she'd named you in her will." Just that one flat sentence about the money and then gone. I needed the combination. I spent the next 2 days tearing through every piece of paper Caroline had left in the cabin, her notebooks, her maintenance logs, her correspondence files, a box of personal letters in the bedroom closet, the few legal documents she kept in a fireproof box under the bed. I found grocery lists and plant records and a 30-year log of the weather at Wren that she had kept in a series of identical black notebooks. I found letters from people I didn't know, neighbors and former colleagues, and one long correspondence with a woman in Portland, Oregon, that read like something between friendship and intellectual collaboration. I found nothing that looked like a combination. On the 3rd day I went back to the lawyer, a quiet man named Gerald Marsh, whose office was above a tax preparation service on Wren's Main Street. I told him what I'd found. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read, and then he reached into a filing cabinet and produced the original property deed, the one conveying the land from Caroline to me, which I had been given a copy of but hadn't examined closely because it was a standard legal document and I had been preoccupied with not freezing to death. He turned to the last page and pointed. In the bottom margin, in Caroline's handwriting, small enough to look like a printer's registration mark if you weren't looking for it, was a sequence of numbers, 3 groups, separated by dashes. "She told me it was there," Gerald said. "She said you'd need it eventually." I drove back up the mountain. The combination worked on the first try. The vault door was 8 inches thick and swung outward on hinges so well balanced that it moved with almost no resistance, silent on bearings that had been maintained with the same care Caroline brought to everything else. The space behind it was not large, roughly 8 feet by 6 feet, carved out of what had been dead space between the cabin's exterior log wall and the interior drywall partition. The air that came out when the door opened was cool and dry and slightly pressurized, the air of a sealed space, and it smelled of paper and the particular neutrality of a place designed to preserve rather than inhabit. The walls inside were lined with steel shelving. On the shelves were document boxes, each one labelled in Caroline's clear hand and dated. There were 27 boxes. The dates on the labels ran from 1991 to the year of her death. 30 years of documentation, organised with the precision of an archivist. In the centre of the room, on a small table bolted to the floor, was a sealed metal case. I opened it. Inside were 2 things: a large envelope, sealed and addressed to me by name, and a stack of cash secured with a rubber band, which I counted later and came to $11,000 in mixed bills. I sat down on the floor of the vault, cross-legged with the envelope in my lap, and I opened it. Caroline's letter was 11 pages long. She had written it in stages. She explained at the outset, over the last 3 years of her life, revising and adding as circumstances developed, because the story she needed to tell me was not static, and she wanted me to have the most current version of it. She wrote with the tone of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has arrived at the end of the carrying. She started at the beginning. In 1989, she had been a junior partner at a Boston real estate development firm, not my parents' firm, which did not yet exist, but the larger firm where my father had been a senior associate and where the 2 of them had worked together, and where, she wrote, she had first understood what kind of man her brother was. The firm had been involved in the acquisition of a portfolio of residential properties in the Roxbury and Dorchester neighborhoods of Boston, properties occupied mostly by working-class and low-income families, black and immigrant communities, people who did not have the resources to fight displacement or the legal knowledge to recognize when they were being defrauded. My father and 2 partners had orchestrated a scheme to systematically falsify building code violations, fabricate condemnation orders, and bribe a network of city inspectors to force tenants out of properties that were then acquired at distressed prices, renovated, and resold at returns that were, Caroline noted, with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years thinking about this, obscene. She had found out because she was methodical and because one of the inspectors had a crisis of conscience and come to her, the only woman in the partnership, because he thought she might be different. She was. She had gone to the firm's managing partner with what the inspector told her and the documentation she had gathered to support it. The managing partner had thanked her for her diligence and told her the matter would be reviewed internally. 3 weeks later, a building in Dorchester burned down. The building had been part of the portfolio. 6 families had been in the process of contesting their eviction through a tenant advocacy organization. All 6 families lost everything they owned in the fire. The fire department ruled it accidental. Caroline did not believe it was accidental. She wrote the name of the inspector who had come to her in the margin of the fire department's report and noted that he had resigned from the city 2 weeks after the fire and that she had been unable to locate him since. She brought all of this to the managing partner again. This time, there was no thanks. She was offered a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement, and she was told, with the precision of a person who has thought carefully about what they are saying, that she should consider very carefully what kind of future she wanted to have in Boston real estate. She did not sign the NDA. She left the firm. She went to the FBI. The investigation that followed was, in Caroline's telling, one of the more comprehensive failures of the federal system she had ever observed. Documents were lost. Witnesses recanted. The inspector she had named was never found. 2 years of investigation produced nothing actionable, and the case was closed. By that time, my father and his 2 partners had left the larger firm and established Reeves Capital, which became the foundation of everything I had grown up in. Caroline had spent the next 30 years watching and documenting. She had sources she did not name, contacts inside city government and the real estate industry who fed her information over decades. She had hired private investigators at various points, paying them with money she earned from consulting work she did remotely, the kind of unglamorous financial analysis work that paid modestly and left her time for what she actually cared about. She had built, box by labeled box on the shelves of the vault in the north wall of her cabin, a record of everything my parents' firm had done. It was extensive. The Roxbury and Dorchester properties were the beginning, not the whole story. There were 3 additional displacement schemes over the following 15 years, each more sophisticated than the last, as my parents learned which systems could be exploited and which regulators were buyable. There was a tax fraud structure so complex it had taken Caroline 2 years, and a forensic accountant she had paid out of pocket to fully untangle. There was a network of shell companies running back to 2 offshore accounts, documents tracing money flows between Boston and accounts in the Cayman Islands, and one in Liechtenstein that my father had apparently established in 1997 and maintained ever since. And then, near the end of the letter, Caroline's handwriting changed. It became slightly smaller, the way handwriting does when the writer is choosing words with unusual care. The man from the 1991 fire, the inspector who had resigned, whom she had never been able to locate. His name was David Ortega. He had been 34 years old, married, with 2 young children living in East Boston. Caroline had hired a private investigator in 2019 to make one more attempt to find him. The investigator had found him in 6 weeks. He was buried in an unmarked plot in a cemetery in Worcester under a name Caroline had never heard before. He had died in 1992, 11 months after the Dorchester fire. The death had been ruled a suicide. Caroline had the investigator's full report. It was in Box 21, labelled Ortega/1992. She had his name. She had his real burial location. She had the evidence of the identity he had apparently been given and then apparently silenced under. She had not been able to prove murder, but she had assembled enough that she believed a federal investigation with actual resources could. My parents had not disowned me because I was a disappointment. They had disowned me because my op-ed, published in a university newspaper, had named their firm specifically in a discussion of displacement practices in Boston, and because they had people watching for exactly that kind of thing, and because I had demonstrated in their assessment that I had Caroline's instincts and would eventually arrive at Caroline's conclusions. They had cut me off and sent me to the cabin in the hope that poverty and isolation would keep me busy enough, or break me down enough, that the evidence in the vault would rot away untouched. They knew about the vault. They had known for years. They had simply never been able to get into it, and they had calculated that without the combination, which was nowhere except in Caroline's possession, and as it turned out, in the margin of a property deed held by a small-town lawyer in North Carolina. The vault would outlast me. What they had not calculated was that I had been working at a hardware store for 6 weeks, that I was stubborn in ways that had always annoyed them and now served me well, and that a nor'easter in the Blue Ridge Mountains could split a drywall patch clean open on a Tuesday night in January. I read the letter through twice. Then I sat in the vault for a while in the dry, still air, looking at 27 document boxes, and I thought about David Ortega and his 2 children in East Boston and the name on the unmarked grave in Worcester that wasn't his real name. I thought about the 6 families who had lost everything in the Dorchester fire. I thought about my father's flat voice on the phone, telling me the property was worthless and then ending the call. I thought about Caroline, who had spent 30 years in this cabin in the mountains, keeping the only record that any of it had happened. Then, I got up and started going through the boxes. I spent 4 days in the vault, reading. I did not go to the hardware store. I called Dot and told her I had a family emergency, which was true in a way I couldn't explain. I ate from the dry goods on Caroline's shelves and kept the wood stove burning and read, taking my own notes in a new notebook I bought in Wren, building a chronology of everything Caroline had documented. By the 4th day, I had a timeline that ran to 40 pages and a clear enough picture of the evidence that I understood 2 things. It was real, and it was enough. I had started to think about next steps, lawyers, federal agencies, the sequence of things, when I came back to the cabin from an afternoon walk and found that someone had been inside. It was not obvious. Whoever it was had been careful. But I had been living alone in a small space for 2 months, and I had Caroline's habit of noticing the position of things, and the chair at the kitchen table was 6 inches from where I had left it, and the maintenance log I had left open on the shelf above the wood stove was closed. I stood in the doorway and looked at the room, and understood that someone had come up the mountain while I was gone, and had come inside and looked around. They had not found the vault. The storm damage to the north wall was still there, the cracked drywall, but I had nailed a piece of plywood over the gap from the inside after I found the vault, and it looked like a repair rather than a concealment, unless you knew what was behind it. They had not found the document case, which I had moved to the bedroom closet, but they had been here, and they had been looking for something, and the only people who knew I was here and had any reason to send someone to look were my parents. I was not frightened exactly. I was something more focused than frightened. I understood that I was now in a different situation than I had been that morning, and that the timeline I had been planning, careful, methodical, get a lawyer, take the right steps in the right order, had just compressed. I packed the document case and Caroline's most critical evidence boxes into my car. I took the cash. I took my notebooks. I took the letter. I left the rest of the boxes in the vault and locked the vault and left the cabin and drove down the mountain, and I was at the bottom of the dirt track turning onto the state road when I saw headlights coming up. 2 vehicles, moving fast for a mountain road in January. I turned the other way and drove toward Wren, and in the rearview mirror, I watched the headlights disappear up the track toward the cabin. I kept driving. I did not stop until I was in Asheville, 40 minutes away, where I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel and my heart doing something unpleasant in my chest. Then I called Gerald Marsh. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him, quickly and factually, what I had found and what had just happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he knew a federal attorney in Asheville who he trusted, and that he thought I should be in that person's office first thing in the morning. I said I agreed. He said he would make the call tonight, and I should find somewhere safe to sleep that was not my name on a credit card. I said I understood. I slept in my car in the parking garage of an Asheville mall with the document case on the back seat and the cash in my jacket and my phone on, and it was not comfortable and I did not sleep well. And at 2 a.m, I got a text from Gerald that said simply, "The cabin burned. Are you safe?" I typed back that I was safe. I lay there in the dark of the parking garage and thought about Caroline, who had built that cabin and lived in it for 30 years, and kept her records in the vault in the north wall, and left me the combination in the margin of a deed. She had known, I thought, that it might end this way. She had known or suspected what my parents were capable of, because she had known it for 30 years. She had kept the evidence anyway, and she had left it to me, and she had put the combination somewhere they couldn't get to it without me. The cabin was gone. The vault was gone. The evidence inside it, all but what I had taken, was gone with it. My parents had calculated that destroying the structure would destroy the record. They had not calculated Caroline's habit of making copies. Box 13, I had discovered on the 3rd day of reading, contained duplicates. Not of every document, but of the most critical ones. The fraud records, the shell company structures, the Ortega investigation. Caroline had photographed every critical page and stored the photographs on a series of encrypted drives, and those drives were in the document case on my back seat because box 13 had been one of the boxes I had packed into the car. In the morning, I sat across from a federal attorney named Sandra Okafor, who had a reputation in Asheville that Gerald described as someone who did not start cases she did not intend to finish. I gave her everything: the drives, the original documents, the letter, my own 40 pages of notes. She read for 3 hours, while I drank her assistant's terrible coffee and watched the morning happen through her office window. When she looked up, she asked me 3 questions. The first was whether I understood that this process would be long and disruptive and ugly. I said I understood. The second was whether I had any interest in settling or negotiating some outcome that stopped short of prosecution. I said I did not. The third was whether I had any idea what I was starting. I told her I had a pretty good idea what my parents had started 30 years ago, and that I was finishing it for Caroline. She nodded once, with the efficiency of someone who has made a decision. Then she picked up her phone and made the first call. The federal investigation that followed took 11 months. I'm not going to describe all of it here, because most of it happened in rooms I was not in, conducted by people with authority and resources I did not have. And the truth is that once I handed Sandra Okafor the drives and the documents, my role became largely one of being available and patient. I answered questions when asked. I gave depositions. I identified documents. I stayed in Asheville for the first 3 months and then moved back to Wren because I was going to need to deal with the land eventually, and because it cost less, and because I discovered the mountains had gotten into me in those 2 winter months, and I was not ready to leave them. I got a full-time job at a small environmental consulting firm based in Asheville that did watershed assessment work in the Blue Ridge. It was exactly the kind of work my environmental science degree had been pointed toward, and exactly the kind of work my parents had told me was impractical. I was paid modestly, and I worked hard, and I was, for the first time in my working life, doing something that felt continuous with my own values, rather than in constant low-grade conflict with them. The day I had been told to be available came on a Thursday in November, 13 months after I had driven down the mountain with the document case on my back seat. Sandra Okafor had called me the week before and told me she wanted me present when the warrants were executed. She did not say why, exactly, but I understood that it was because Caroline was not alive to see it. And Sandra was the kind of person who understood that these things should be witnessed. My parents' firm occupied 2 floors of a glass office building in the Back Bay. I had been in the building twice as a child, brought to see where my father worked with the reverent gravity with which some families take children to church. I had not been back since. I stood on the sidewalk outside with Sandra and 2 other attorneys from her team and watched the federal agents go in first. And then we followed. The lobby receptionist stared at us. People in the elevator stared at us. On the 14th floor, where the boardroom occupied the corner with the best view of the Charles River, a junior associate tried to intercept us at the door and was moved aside with professional thoroughness. My father was at the head of the table, my mother was to his left. There were 4 other people in the room, partners and senior staff, and they all looked at us with the expressions of people who have not yet caught up to what is happening. My father looked at me. It was the first time I had seen him since the dining room table and the 12-minute conversation and the envelope with $300. He looked older. He looked like what he was, which was a man who had spent 30 years being careful and had just run out of room. I watched him understand, in the space of about 3 seconds, what my presence in this room alongside federal agents meant. I watched him understand that the cabin had not been empty when his people burned it. I watched him understand about Caroline. He did not say anything. I had thought for months that I would have something to say. Some final word, some version of justice delivered in language. But I stood there and looked at him and found that I had nothing to say that the agents on either side of me were not already saying more precisely and with more authority than I could. My mother was looking at her hands. My father was looking at me. They left in handcuffs. Both of them. Walked through the lobby they had built their lives around and out through the glass doors onto the sidewalk where a small crowd of office workers from surrounding buildings had gathered to watch. I did not follow them out. I stood at the window of the boardroom and watched the street below and thought about David Ortega in his unmarked grave in Worcester and the 6 families in Dorchester and Caroline in her cabin in the mountains with 30 years of evidence and no one to give it to until she found me. The convictions came 14 months later, multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion, and a conspiracy charge that Sandra had constructed with the kind of architectural precision that made you understand why she had her reputation. The murder, David Ortega, 1992, was harder, as Caroline had known it would be, but the investigators found enough in the 30 years of evidence and the physical record Sandra's team developed to charge my father's original partner on a second-degree charge that resulted in a plea deal that put him away for 18 years. My father and mother received 12 and 9 years respectively. Their assets were frozen pending civil forfeiture proceedings that would take years to resolve. I did not attend the sentencing. I was in Wren, on the 4 acres where Caroline's cabin had stood, with a surveyor and a structural engineer I had hired to assess the land. The foundation of the cabin was still there, the vault door still visible in the ruins of the north wall, the metal buckled and blackened from the fire, but intact in the way that things made to be intact remain. The vault had done what it was built to do. The 4 acres were mine, legally uncomplicated, taxes paid. The land was on a south-facing slope at 2,600 feet, mixed hardwood forest on 3 sides and the meadow where the cabin had stood on the 4th, and a seasonal creek running along the eastern boundary. The surveyor walked the property lines with me and pointed out things I had not noticed in the winter. The quality of the soil, the drainage pattern, the way the slope caught the afternoon sun. I had been thinking through all the months of the investigation about what to do with the land. I had thought about rebuilding the cabin, restoring it to what Caroline had made it. But that felt like preservation rather than building, and I was 21 years old now, and I had learned some things about the difference. I hired an architect in Asheville, a woman who specialized in sustainable mountain construction and who had worked on several watershed restoration projects with my firm. We designed something modest and functional and deeply considered, a small building that sat lightly on the land and used the slope and the sun orientation the way Caroline had used everything she had, deliberately, without waste, in service of the actual purpose rather than the appearance of it. I named the business that operates from that land Reeves Ridge Consulting. We do environmental impact assessment and watershed work in the Blue Ridge, the same work I had been doing with the Asheville firm, but independently now, with the specific focus on development projects and whether they serve or harm the communities around them. It is not a large business. It is not a lucrative one, by the standards my parents used to measure those things. I have 2 employees and more work than we can currently handle, and a small reputation in Western North Carolina for being thorough and difficult to pressure, which is the reputation I want. The surveyor found something when he walked the property lines on the last day of the assessment. On the eastern boundary, along the creek, there was a stone marker he hadn't expected, older than the current deed, carved with initials he couldn't identify. He photographed it and noted it in his report without explanation. I went back and looked at it on my own the following weekend, and I stood there by the water for a while thinking about Caroline and the 30 years she had spent on this land and everything she had built into its walls. She had left me the only thing she had. She had known exactly what it was worth. She had understood that I was the right person to receive it, for the same reason my parents had understood it, because I had her instincts and would eventually arrive at her conclusions, but unlike them, she had thought that was a reason to give me something, rather than a reason to cut me off. My name is Maya Reeves. I am 20 years old. I was 20 when it started, and the time since has moved in that compressed, weighty way that time moves when a great deal happens inside it. The land is mine. The business is mine. The foundation in the meadow where Caroline's cabin stood is still there, and on clear evenings I sometimes sit on it and watch the last of the light leave the mountains. And I think about what it means to build something on ground that someone else prepared, and what you owe to the preparing. I think the answer is everything. I think the answer is that you owe it everything you have. Caroline knew that. She spent 30 years proving it. I intend to spend the rest of my life in the same direction,